Hello, how's everyone? Hopefully you're doing good. Welcome to my presentation. This is Gassana Maduri, and I'm an international nursing student from Oman. And in this presentation, I reflect on my learning and growth throughout this Indigenous Health Studies course, and speaking in a fast tone to fit it in the 10-minute time frame. And over the course of this semester, I have explored the history, struggles, resilience of indigenous peoples, and how their health and well-being were deeply influenced by colonization, genocides, and systematic violence, I'll call it. And using my Story Robe symbols and for element reflection, I will talk about how my understanding of indigenous health has evolved and was reshaped, and how these teachings really changed my perspective. So let's start. Starting first with settler colonialism and doctrine of discovery symbol. This symbol has helped me reshape my perspective and understanding of colonization. It wasn't only just an historical event, but more of like an ongoing structure that affects health outcomes today. Coming from Oman, I had never realized how legal concepts like terra nullius were used to justify taking like indigenous lands in Canada and stuff. It made me reflect how and see the invisibility of indigenous sovereignty in systems I benefit from as a newcomer. Like the Anglican Church doctrine of discovery video showed me how deeply colonial thinking shaped health, land, and power. And of course, as a future nurse, I will now realize that I must understand the historical trauma behind health, diaspora, and like the commit to culture, humility in my practice, of course. The second symbol really reflects on my learning about Métis Nation, fur trade, and resistance. I was struck by how Métis identity grew from relationships between indigenous women and fur traders, and how those relationships actually were like later erased by government policies. I can't imagine that. Learning how about Louis Ryle and the resistance to the Canadian Pacific Railway revealed the resilience of indigenous communities in the face of betrayal. Writing about and drawing about this resistance about the rails made me really realize how infrastructure was used to take land, not connect people. It actually really just challenged my earlier beliefs about development. As someone like from different cultural background, I now see parallels in how dominant narratives can erase minority voices. Like, of course, as a nurse, I want to honor these stories and fight for equity in healthcare and education, of course. Thirdly, there's never enough talking about Indian residential schools. It was so emotional. I couldn't imagine being taken away from my family to be re-educated. The readings, and the residential school map shocked me with how widespread the system was. What hit the hardest was understanding the long-term effects, how one generation's trauma can pass on through silence, addiction, and loss of language. As an Amani again, I have always valued strong family ties. Learning that these schools broke indigenous families made me question what cultural survival really means. This symbol reminds me that reconciliation isn't about like these things. It's about listening, acknowledging harm, and working in healthcare with compassion and accountability, of course. In my final symbol, I would like to present missing and murdered indigenous women and girls, and the loss of matriarchal roles. I was shocked by how many indigenous women are still missing today, and how little media attention it gets. The course taught me that colonization and didn't only take like land, it targeted indigenous women who once held like great power in their societies. The 60s scoop and the millennial scoop reminded me how Systematic child appreciation continues under new names. I felt heartbroken to see Indigenous mothers painted as unfit due to racist systems. This symbol taught me that healing must be led by Indigenous women reclaiming their peace, and I must learn how to support that as an oath with cultural safety. With my complete digital story robe, each symbol tells a part of the journey I have gone through during this course. From learning about colonial system to understanding indigenous resistance, trauma, and strength. And again, as an Omani international student, I would like to share that I didn't even expect to be affected by these stories, but now I realize how global and personal colonialism is. This robe represents my transformation, not only in knowledge, but in awareness. As a future nurse, I will carry these teachings with me. I now understand that providing care means recognizing history, power, and privilege, and choosing to stand for the justice and healing, of course. Moving to part two, now we will talk about the four elements. The element of air made me reflect on my identity and the responsibilities I carry as an international student in Canada. I come from Oman, a country with its own rich traditions, but also one where colonialism felt far away. Through this course, I learned how settler colonialism still structures Indigenous life in Canada. Air for me symbolized unsettling realization that I like to benefit from, of course. These systems, by studying living on treaty and land, it also represents like possibility. The idea that I can breathe in new knowledge and exhale humility, and at the end, now I feel like more responsible, not only to learn about Indigenous health, but to speak out when I witnessed injustice. Fire represents service and reciprocity. It has changed how I view nursing profession now. In Oman, service often comes from duty or faith, right? But Indigenous teachings introduced me to the idea of relational accountability, serving not just people, but land, spirit, and ancestors. The teachings from James and Patricia inspired me deeply. The concept of Meo Bimatiswin, if I say it right. The good way of life is rooted in giving back. As I prepare to become a nurse, I now see my role as a bridge between cultures, between systems, and between past and future. Of course, fire reminds me that my learning must become action. As a geology student, this element shook my assumptions. Before this course, I thought of land mostly in physical terms. But now, after I heard indigenous voices, it taught me that the land is living, sacred, and relational. Learning how colonization turned into property made me really uncomfortable, especially when I realized how my presence here is tied to the same system. Back in Oman, land is tied to ancestry too, but not in this deep. Earth reminded me to unlearn the idea of land as something to own, but relearn it as something to honor. I now understand that protecting the land is also healthcare. Earth grounds my commitment to the environment and cultural respect, of course. Water to me represents emotion and truth, and it helped me face the hard truth of anti-Indigenous racism. Watching videos about residential schools, Indian hospitals, and continued violence against Indigenous women brought deep sorrow, but it also brought clarity. I now recognize how racism is embedded in health system through neglect, stereotyping, and silence. I must be actively anti-racist in nursing. This means listening deeply, challenging biased policies, and practicing cultural humility every day. This element reminds me that healing begins with truth, and I'm responsible for carrying the truth into practice.